Um, the theme for our Spring Open Community is spiritual leadership in the midst of an uncertain time. I think another way to talk about it would be just finding a sense of groundedness and certainty in the midst of a lot of the things that are going on in our world is what we're trying to do in terms of these next 3 weeks. And so I tell you what, before I go any further though, let's pause, we'll pray, and then we'll jump right in. Gracious and loving God, we do trust in your love. We do trust in your grace. And we open ourselves to the gift of your presence, even in this space in which we gather tonight. I ask that this would be much more than just a tour of England tonight, but an invitation for us all to grow in our awareness and our faith in you. It is in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so Maggie, if you want to go to the next slide. The themes for the next few weeks are going to be roots. In the midst of a season of uncertainty, I believe it's important to understand who we are, where we came from. Next week, we'll talk about connection and the importance of developing community. And specifically, we'll do a presentation on ways to be involved in small groups. And then in the last session, we're going to talk about service and caring for our community. And so Pastor Glenda is going to do the presentation next week, and then Pastor Jerry Reardon is going to do the final presentation 2 weeks from tonight. And each time we get together, we're going to hope to give you a practice and something you can do in a concrete way. So I think that's what, if nothing else, that's what's really important, is to find things that we can do and have some agency. And so we hope to give that to you in the next few weeks. So tonight, though, our talk is going to be on my trip to England, which I'm sure you already know about. I went to England about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and my hope in going to England is, this is going to be another massive shocker for you. My hope in going to England was to learn a little bit about John Wesley, which is, of course, one of my spiritual heroes. It's always been a bucket list for me to go there and to see some of the places where Wesley really was, and I was able to do that. I have a good friend that I went to seminary with, actually, who lives there, and there's a picture of him, Adam Payne, and we went to seminary together. We sat in the back row together for many classes, and he's been after me to come see him in England because he serves a church there. It's called the Godalming United Church is the official name of that congregation, and it's a merger. His congregation is a merger of folks from the Reformed tradition and then the British Methodist tradition. That building that you see behind us is the congregation or the sanctuary for the British Methodist, and its original name of that church was the Hugh Price Hughes Memorial Methodist Church. That was the name of it. And of course, I had to know, well, who is Hugh Price Hughes? And he was an important Methodist evangelist in the 1800s. And the thing that was really cool about Hugh Price Hughes that I learned was that he really worried about how the gospel was being presented in that time in a very individualistic way. He believed that the gospel, Hugh Price Hughes believed that the gospel needed to be applied in a social way too. And he really held to that balance. And you'll notice tonight as we go through our presentation, Methodists at our best, we hold to that balance. That sure, our faith is an individual choice, but it must end in the way that we respond to the needs of the world. And so Hugh Price Hughes was a very effective evangelist because he held that tension together. And so I learned all that about him. So anyway, the next slide is something I talked about a couple weeks ago. This is a group of Methodists from Nigeria that I met right outside of Methodist Central Hall. And Methodist Central Hall is the Methodist church that's really almost across the street from Westminster Abbey. And it's a beautiful place. Vince Anderson was just telling me that's where they were able to. You went to Westminster for Easter, right? You went to Westminster for Easter, but you've seen this place that we were at. And it's a beautiful church, a lot of pretty stuff in that sanctuary, but the most beautiful thing that I found was this group of people standing outside on the street corner, right outside of Methodist Central Hall, singing hymns, passionately singing hymns. And my friends that I was with, they were like, please don't go talk to him. And so I'm like, I just had to go talk to him. I was like, that's so awesome. And when I told them I was a pastor, they were like, you thought the second coming had just occurred, like, praise the Lord. Yeah. And so they even made me do like a little video with them where I welcomed the congregation. So who knows who I said, God bless you to, as a result of that experience. But if you've ever been to this place, there's Westminster Abbey. There's all these different statues of very important people. There's Methodist Central Hall. It's a very busy place. When I was in this area, I think I counted like 8 or 10 different languages being spoken. It's so diverse. And yet, here's these folks, singing about their faith. It's kind of challenging, really, and so excited. This is another thing I saw when I was in England. This place is called St. Mary's Church, and this is the ministry, Chit Chat Ministry. This is a ministry that this congregation offers for people that have immigrated to England. And once a week, they open their church up, and they have different tables set up with leaders at the table. And basically what they do is they practice English. So these folks are learning English. English is a second language to them, and then so they come and they practice English. And I mentioned this in the sermon, but one of the most meaningful stories I heard was they had a doctor from Syria at this ministry, and across the sanctuary, he saw one of his patients, and they united. It was just to hear them tell that story, it's powerful, it's so meaningful. And the next slide, that's St. Paul's Cathedral, which is in London, and that became a symbol of the resistance during World War II, during the Nazi Blitz of London. They worked very hard to protect that place and to keep it intact. And this is a picture of the inside of it. And you can see it's just, it doesn't even give it justice if you've ever been there. It's like, oh my gosh, just awe-inspiring. But the cool thing that happened while I was there, though, was that different times, it's actually an active congregation still. And so it's not just a place where tourists go, it's an active congregation. At one point while we were there, the priest goes up to the podium and says, we're getting ready to have a prayer service. Invite you to join us. They do a little prayer service, and then afterwards the priest says, I'll be here hanging out. If you have any questions about the Christian faith, spirituality, I love to talk to you. And that caught my attention. I thought, how cool was that? That's a non-confrontational way to invite people to have conversation about their faith. And the thing that occurred to me was, and this is something, Randy, you and I can talk about, is I wonder what that would look like for us here at the church. We have a lot of different groups that come here, recovery groups, different things. What would it look like for us maybe to go there and just say, hey, look, we're so glad you're here, a part of using our building, and we're glad you're here. If you ever have a question about the faith, we'd love to talk to you. I just thought, how cool is that? It's just, so many times folks use our building and we never see them, never talk to them. And as I watched that priest, that's one of the things that occurred to me. So, yeah. And it wasn't all going to different churches. Does anyone know what this is a picture of? Anyone? Richmond, yes. Ted Lasso. Yeah, I did the Ted Lasso tour. Yes. And so that's where Ted Lasso, the Apple TV Plus show that started in 2020 during COVID. If you don't know anything about Ted Lasso show, he's an American football coach that gets hired to coach a British Premier League soccer team. He doesn't know the first thing about soccer, but he knows a lot about people. It's this really kind of inspiring TV show, and that wasn't very far from where we were at, and so we had to go to the Ted Lasso bar, and you can see there I am sitting there by Ted Lasso corner, and there's the Ted Lasso bar. But there is a comment from that show I really love. If you go to the next one, this is what Ted Lasso says, and just kind of give you a context. The British have a statement where they often say, it's the hope that kills us. It's the hope that kills us. It's the longing for the world to change. It's the hoping that things become different. It's that longing that things will, not be as they are, and holding on to that kills the human spirit. This is what Ted Lasso says. I love it. He says, I think it's the lack of hope that gets you. You see, I believe in hope. And to be honest with you, the reason I went to England was to find my grounding again. because I needed a little bit of hope. That's why I went. You know, my buddy's been after me for a while. There's a lot of things going on in the world. And I thought, okay, I'll pull the trigger on this. Let's go. I need a little hope. And so, and that's kind of what I was searching for, listening in for when I started doing the John Wesley tour, which is, of course, more what we're going to get into in just a moment. The John Wesley tour is the bucket list type of thing that I was really interested in. And in England, you can't turn the corner hardly where there's not a place where John Wesley's horse was tied, to be honest with you. I mean, there's little things everywhere. But I went to a couple of the big places when I was there. My favorite one was Bristol, though. If you go to the next slide, there's a picture of Bristol there, so you kind of know where it's at. You see, it's more or less on the western end of England, the south, kind of western there. It's a port city, and this is a picture of, they call it New Hall. So this is a very busy city. Bristol's a very busy city. In the time of John Wesley, it was the second biggest city behind London. It was a slave town. The poor population and poverty was very high there. And so the thing that's so cool about this place in Bristol they call New Room is it actually gives us a picture what the early Methodists really looked like, what it looked like when John Wesley left it. And see, what happened to a lot of Methodists is as things go, churches evolve and they become fancy and they become established and they evolve beyond the place where they really began. Bristol is what it looked like when John Wesley left. He built this place that you're going to get ready to take a look at. They built this place in 1739. And so there's a kind of a plaque. It says, you can't probably see it from where you're at, but it says, this is the first chapel and dwelling house of the Methodist, is what it says. You go to the next one. There he is with his horse. Rode over 250,000 miles, and there's a representation of John Wesley's horse. And here we get into the church. So originally, New Room would not have had these pews. These were put in, the pews that you see in this picture were put in the 1930s. And originally, there were just have been benches in the sanctuary. And they would have held services at 5 or 6 in the morning so that when people were coming, when the people were on their way to work, they would be able to go to worship before the work started, and they would have prayer services in this place. And then when it was over, they'd clear the floor. So all these benches would be moved, and then it would become a food pantry. It would become a school for children. They would use this space in multiple ways. This was not just a sanctuary. This was a place where ministry took place. I love that. I love that about New Room. If you look close, if you notice there on the very bottom level, there are no windows in New Room. Why do you think they put no windows in their church building in New Room? Any thoughts on that? Exactly. Security. Methodists they were suspicious of the Methodists because they went outside of the institution of the Church of England. The Methodists were intentionally trying to reach the poor and the impoverished. They were going outside of what was deemed as the way things should be, and so people did not always like that. And so when they built this facility, they didn't put any windows on the bottom floor because people would throw things at them and different things like that while they were preaching and were gathered in the building. If you go to the next slide, another thing I'll point out about this sanctuary is you'll notice that really there's kind of like a wall where the pastor would have been. Originally, my friend Adam, you see him in the picture, he's standing there looking at a stairway that goes up. That stairway was added later. Originally, there was no stairway that went up. So that pulpit is kind of that white square that you see kind of high up. The pastor would come and preach, and there would be like a wall between him and the congregation because there were times where there were riots and people didn't like to hear what they had to say. There was one time, actually, that the people who were involved in slave trading in Bristol, the business owners arranged a riot to take place while they were having services. And so this design of this building enabled John Wesley and the other Methodist ministers to make a fast getaway whenever they had these issues. I find all that very fascinating. We actually got to do a communion service there. A British Methodist pastor came and did a little communion service there. It was very cool. You can go to the next slide. We also went to London, and this is where Wesley London would have been more his home base. Bristol's where I will talk about a little bit later on. Bristol is more or less where the Methodist revival really gets started. But honestly, Wesley leaves Bristol in the hands of Charles Wesley, his brother, and he ends up going to London and spends a lot of his time in London. And you go back to the map real quick, just to kind of give perspective. You can see Bristol on that map. It's the big orange dot. London would be kind of east of there, in that south kind of east corner of England. The thing that I noticed as we were driving from London to Bristol, it took like 2 hours to get there, by the way. And I thought to myself, well, John Wesley would just get on his horse and ride over there. Like if you look in his journal, it's like, well, today I started off towards Bristol, and then like Thursday he got there or something. And you're like, man, how different it was back in those days. Any case, so London, this is called Wesley Chapel, and this is where they would have had another preaching house. Actually, John Wesley's house is here too. And I'm going to show you some more pictures about that. But that's kind of the way you can see Wesley's house there. There's a wall. So let's stop there. This is where he prayed. Of all the pictures, of course, I wanted this one. And so his bedroom is a very small room. And off of his bedroom, there's this little room, his prayer room. And Wesley would get up in the morning around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and he would pray every day. And they said that typically he would spend about 4 hours a day in prayer when he was a young man, and about 8 hours when he got older, which is a lot of praying. So it was kind of funny when we were in this room. So we were taking a tour. My friend Adam and I were taking a tour, and as we were taking the tour, our group just kept getting bigger. And then as our group got bigger, it became more diverse too. It became more like an international type of thing. So we had some folks from India, then we had some folks from Africa, then we had, I think, some folks from Chile, and then they had us. Well, our tour guide was this really nice lady from Africa, and she hands out to each of us a copy of Wesley's Covenant Prayer. You all know what Wesley's Covenant Prayer is. If you don't know what that is, just look it up in your hymnal. The hardback hymnal is a copy of it. She hands each of us a copy of Wesley's Covenant Prayer. She says to us, now I want you all to pray it in your own language. And then she goes, I got to go, I'll be right back. And so we're kind of standing there like, well, what are we supposed to do? At which point the Indian pastor kneels down right in front of us and starts to pray in his native tongue, his native language. I have no idea what he says, except for at one point in his 10-minute prayer, he says, the world is our parish, which is a John Wesley quote. All the while, I'm looking over my friend Adam, and I'm like, please ask him to pray next. Please ask him to pray next. Because you could just see how uncomfortable he was. It was just funny. You have to know Adam. It was so funny. So, and guess what? He got to pray next. I'm like, yes. But it's a pretty cool moment, though, in the sense that you got to see how far Methodist has spread in so many different places. It was really cool. But that's his prayer room. That's where he would have prayed. So the next slide is his bed. This is where he died. John Wesley's last words were, anyone? Best of all, God is with us. After all this time, 1703 to 1791, and all these sermons, and all these things he did, he ends it all, and he says, and best of all, God's with us, and that's it. In that bed. And the next slide. That's one of his pulpits, which kind of looks similar to some of ours. You can see it's older. He would have preached typically about 2 or 3 times a day, on average. It's incredible. And then that's his tomb. Yep. And we'll stop there. Aldersgate, that's Aldersgate Street. You wouldn't know it was there. It's this old it's kind of like it seems like a very urban area now, but they have this kind of plaque there. It's you can't read it on the picture, but it's the copy of what he wrote in his journal on that moment in Aldersgate. And I've talked about this at sermons before, but that's where it says that John Wesley's heart was strangely warmed. And you can go to the next slide, and there's a quote from what he wrote in his journal. And Methodist Current have made a big deal out of what we call the Aldersgate moment. Churches have been named after Aldersgate, and so I've learned a couple things about Aldersgate while I was in England that I was not necessarily prepared for. I'll get into that in just a little bit, but sometimes people have gone as far to say, though, that Aldersgate was John Wesley's conversion moment. I'll tell you here, and then I'll tell you later on, I don't think that's the case for John Wesley. I think he was very much a committed Christian before this moment, but in the Aldersgate moment, his confidence grew. His confidence grew. And I'll talk a little bit why I think that is. So we'll go to the next one. And of course, he has his own walkway, and I had to take a picture of it. There it is. So, yeah. All right. So what did I learn? I went to Bristol, saw John Wesley's house, a couple of different places. What I learned, well, I just kind of alluded to it. His conversion, I think, happened probably in 1725 and not in 1738. I'm geeking out, I know. 1738 is when the Aldersgate experience happens. He says, I felt my heart strangely warm, and I felt I did trust in Christ. And he has a spiritual experience there. But I believe John Wesley's real conversion happened 13 years earlier when he gets ordained as a deacon, and that's when his journal begins. That's when it starts. Lent 1725, he starts keeping track every day of his experiences and how he felt close, further away from God in that journal. He begins to take his faith very seriously then. And so I think the reason why Aldersgate gets to be a big deal in America is because in America and in England, in some ways, in the mid-1800s up through the mid-1900s, we have a lot of revival preaching happening in the Methodism. And so the Aldersgate experience becomes an easy story to promote. This is what should happen to you in the Aldersgate. Like John Wesley had in Aldersgate, this is what should happen to us in a revival type setting. And that's so American of us, if you stop and think about it. I'm going to go to a church service. Why am I going to go to church service? So I can have my heart strangely warmed and have this emotional experience, and it's going to be wonderful and great, and then I'm going to go on with my life. No, a Christian life is more like the 1725 version, where you say, I'm going to commit myself, I'm going to discipline myself to being a follower of Christ. I'm going to journal about my experiences. I'm going to take my experiences seriously. I'm going to commit myself to this path, whether or not I have a warm and fluffy emotional experience or not. Along the way, we're going to have experiences where we feel close to God, and yes, our hearts will be strangely warmed in different moments and different experiences. Those are going to happen, but that's not what we seek. We're disciplining ourselves. That was an aha moment for me. Also, this is a picture of the John Wesley Holy Club. So I'm arguing that Wesley became a committed Christian in 1725. The Holy Club, which is where we ultimately get the name Methodist, they get that started in 1729, so 4 years later. And so the Holy Club was a group of college students, that's how I'll describe it, college students that got together on a regular basis, and they were also trying to take their faith seriously too. And they were so committed to what they were doing that they got made fun of by the other college students, and they called them Methodist. They really didn't like the name, but it stuck, and that's how we get the name Methodist today. It was a group of about 6 college students who typically what they didn't get together and like pray all the time. You know, they did that some, but really what they were committed to doing was serving their community. And particularly what they did was they would visit prisons. And they did that a lot. I was reading in the museum, one of the members of the Holy Club actually ends up becoming more and more prominent, more and more influential, and ultimately ends up reforming the British prison system. And it starts at the Holy Club. So in your packet, you'll see the 22 questions that John Wesley asked the people in the Holy Club to take a look at as they made their journal entries. Invited people to ask themselves that question every day. 22 questions right there. I mean, I know it's pretty serious, but I show that to you I think there's some pretty good questions in there really to think about that could be relevant to us today. Just curious what question maybe sticks out for you real quick. A couple of the ones I thought were pretty cool were did I give the Bible time to speak to me today? I like that one. And I really like the last one. Is Christ real to me? So, yeah. Yep. Maggie, it looks like I lost my slides there. Yep. So, yeah. That was not in England. That's a different slide. So, just curious, anybody, does any other questions stick out to you? I don't have it memorized yet, Rob. Yeah.
Do I insist upon doing something about which my conscience is uneasy?
Yeah, that's a doozy of a question. So, yeah. So, anybody else?
Am I proud?
What's that?
Am I proud?
Am I proud? Yeah. Then the first one's an interesting one. Do I act as if I'm better than I am? In other words, am I a hypocrite? So, we all are a little bit, I would say. So, yeah. So here's what the Holy Club rules were beyond the 22 questions. They would try to read their Bible every day, pray, interesting enough, each day, every day, serve the poor and needy in the local community every day. And I had to cut down my slides a little bit, but I had some quotes from some of the people who didn't quite like the Methodists, and they said basically, these Methodists, they try to starve themselves so they could give away to the needy. They're always fasting. That's the kind of things they were saying about them. So you go to the next slide, you could talk about every week they would meet and encourage each other. They were encouraged to worship at the church, and also they would do things like fasting and taking communion. Fasting, I think that's something that we're going to kind of promote this Lenten season. Randy, you talked about it today. Fasting is something we don't talk about very much. And it's definitely recommended again and again through Christian tradition. So just hold off on that. I'm going to talk about fasting a little bit on Sunday. So anyway, so there's the 22 questions. Let's go to the next one. The second thing I learned is that the revival probably started in 1739. Again, not 1738. If you've heard Methodist preachers preach about the Methodist revival, you've probably heard us say at some point that the Methodist revival started in Aldersgate Street when John Wesley had his heartwarming experience in 1738. He went to this prayer meeting. His heart was strangely warmed. He was this terminator for God ever since and never slowed down. No, that's not what happened. He has a heartwarming experience and he goes away to Germany. And he meets with a group of people called the Moravians for a year. And they talk about him as not being too confident yet. I find that encouraging because I know what that's like. I have these heartwarming experiences with God, I believe, and then I'm still not sure. The revival starts in 1739 when John Wesley basically because of the prodding and the pushing of his friend George Whitefield, who was another early Methodist preacher, talked him into preaching open air, preaching outdoors. The revival really starts, in my opinion, when they start taking the show on the road. And no longer would they be confined to the institution of the church, but they begin to go to the poor and the needy of their time. Because the poor and the needy were not going to the church. The Church of England at that time was elite. It was mixed up with the aristocracy. monarchy, those kinds of things. And the poor and the needy of England were being left out and left behind. And what John Wesley and the early Methodists did is they were one of the first groups to actually connect with the working class and the poor of England. And some sociologists argue that because they did this, some would argue that they saved England from having a revolution like some of the other European countries were having in the 1700s, France, for example. They gave the poor and the working class a positive path forward on how to use their energy and these things they're feeling in productive ways. But they went to the people. They went to the people. They went to the people. They didn't just open up their building and say, come here to us. That's where it started. Third thing, we'll go past that one. There's a picture of Bristol. I don't know if you can see it or not. Every one of the little circles is where John Wesley preached open air. Like 20 different places. I don't know if you can see it very good or not, so yeah, you can kind of see it. He went to coal mines. He went to houses. He went anywhere and everywhere but in the church buildings, basically. And they got to the point where he really couldn't go to the church buildings because they wouldn't let him in anymore. They didn't like the Methodist. And so, yeah. Let's go to the next one. You've heard me talk about the method of Methodism with small groups. And that was always it. Like you had to be in a small group. I learned that it was an accident. It was an accident. I find that interesting. So if you go back to Bristol, the first place I went, they built that building, new room. So they had this building, and then they thought, how are we going to pay for it? They asked any good question, well, how are we going to pay for it? And someone said, well, how about we divvy up all the church members, and we'll go around and we collect a penny from each of the church members every week, and then we'll pay for the building. Well, what they found out was, after they went and visited all the church members, is that they had a bunch of people who have had these revival-type experiences hearing John Wesley's sermons and preaching, but none of them were actually following the rules anymore. And so then they thought, okay, we need to become more disciplined, and we need to form small groups. It was an accident. Here's a quote. The class meeting was started in 1742 when a group of Methodists were trying to figure out how to pay off a building debt in Bristol. Captain Foy, whom we don't know who that is, suggested that the Bristol Society, that's the church, be divided up into groups of 12 people. One person would be designated and would be responsible to visit everyone in the group each week, collect 1 penny from them. That's how it happened. I find that really cool because I don't know about you, I know about me. I've been to so many church workshops where they give you all these slick strategies, and one strategy that changed the world was an accident. It was an accident. We were just trying to collect money, and then we thought, okay, maybe we should become more intentional about this, and it changed the world, changed England, and changed America. Just a quick fun statistic. When America was born, of course, roughly 1776, 1790, Methodists made up about 2.4% of the population. By the mid-1800s, over 34% of the population were Methodists in the United States. Think about that. 1 in 3 people you met on the street, they were Methodist. What was the secret? They were disciplined. They were disciplined. Every week, they got together in small groups and they talked about the relationship with God, and in doing so, they had a story to tell. And that spread like wildfire. In the packet, in the second sheet, you can see the rules of the early Methodist societies and classes. This is the rules that they had to follow if they were going to be a part of a Methodist church. First, do no harm. Second, do good. The third one is attend to the ordinances of God. Just kind of glance through them real quick. One of the things you'll notice, to me, that stuck out was these rules were tailored toward the working class. These rules were tailored to the poor. These rules were tailored to the kind of challenges that they were facing. You'll see language about taking out loans. You'll see language about not owning slaves. You see language about, they call it spirituous liquor, I think is what the language is. That was gin. The early Methodists were technically not teetotalers. England in the 1700s, they would drink alcohol because the water wasn't great. So they drank alcohol. A lot of times they call it near beer, is what they kind of called it. And it was kind of like they drink it for breakfast and stuff because that's where they got calories sometimes. So that wasn't, they were teetotalers. But gin was a major problem for the poor. They were really having trouble with it. I mean, you might call it like the fentanyl of the 1700s, really. It was an issue. And so Wesley would tell the early Methodists, don't drink that stuff. It'll kill you, basically. So, yeah. I just find it interesting how he tailored the rules towards the working class. I do wonder, what would our rules be today? You know, there's a language in that first rule, you notice, do no harm and avoid evil that is commonly practiced. You see that language in that first rule? I think it's in that first rule. What's the evil that's commonly practiced today that we should be avoiding? That's a question I think the church should be asking. What's that look like? I heard someone say greed. Greed, yeah. Definitely in Western culture today. Absolutely, 100%. Division. Writing people off. Just a couple examples. All right, next, let's go to the next one. And the next slide. The fourth thing I learned about the Methodist movement was it was about survival. It wasn't about as much about, I think, where you go when you die. That was an important question to them. But at the end of the day, it was about survival. And this hit me like a ton of bricks when I was walking through a museum and I saw a slide. And this was the mortality rate of the 1700s England. 1 in 5 kids died before their second birthday. If you're if you're wealthy, your average age was 50. So I'm 45. I'm Social Security age in 1700s England. If you're poor, it's 35. And 6% of the population made it to age 70. Literally, people just dying in this. I mean, there's little plaques all over those museums about people literally dying in the streets. This was before we developed vaccines like we have today. This was before we developed a lot of medical treatment like we have today. People were literally dying in the streets. And Wesley was invested and interested in how to help. One of the things he did was he came up with a health book. They called it the Primitive Physic. I have a copy here if you want to see it. It's interesting. And it was home remedies and health care for people in England. It became a bestseller, by the way. Yeah. Another thing was he wrote a tract on slavery in 1774. Slavery is a huge issue of this time period. It's horrific what we were doing to one another. I just find it interesting he waited to 1774 to write this. Remember, he started in 1725. He waits till 1774 to write this. What was he doing for 50 years? He was earning the right to speak. He wasn't popping off. He wasn't telling people how it is. No, he was out caring for the poor, getting to know people's names, feeding the hungry. Then, after 50 years, he said, let me write this. And it became one of the most influential publications about slavery ever written at that time. It's horrific what was happening too. I got a quote here from Charles Wesley. Side note, he sees this, what he's talking about, in Charleston, South Carolina when the Wesleys come to America. What he's writing about in this quote, he sees this in America. I'm not even going to read it. This is what they witnessed, though. My God. It's a lot longer, actually. I just scaled it back so that it would fit on my slide. It's about survival. You can go to the next slide. Of course, the Industrial Revolution was happening. The gap between the rich and the poor were increasing. That also made it a problem in terms of survival. You can go to the next slide. And this is my favorite thing. I found out that John Wesley was just an okay preacher, which is helpful for me. So this is, I'm not going to read the whole, but it says, someone says, he stood there like a statue and he didn't do a whole lot. He just kind of talked to us. In my mind, John Wesley was like the angel Gabriel on Christmas coming down and like trumpeting the gospel to all people. In my mind, that's John Wesley. This is him, really. He's a regular guy that did what he could. He's like, I'm going to go give a rip about my community. I'm going to give a rip about people. I'm going to go tell them about the good news of God's love. If they listen to me, great. That's really him. His religious devotion, I'm sure, helped him a lot because they knew he was authentic and real. I find that helpful as a pastor. Anyway, but challenging. Oh, here's some quick takeaways. I know we're going to have to wrap it up pretty quick. Here's what I think about when I think of early Methodism now. What we do matters. What we do matters. The whole thing about early Methodism, it was a practical way of life. That's what it was. Look at the rules. Look at the 22 questions. It matters what we do and don't do. Second thing, accountability sure does help. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I think the biggest challenge facing our church, this congregation today, is how do we inspire people to develop relationships beyond Sunday morning? That's always the challenge. We have wonderful worship experiences. That's great. That's a part of what it means to be church. But it's these little groups where people learn one another's names and support and pray for one another. That's where the gold, that's where it happens. It is. You know, whether it's grief share or a Sunday school class or the service opportunity, whatever it is, it's these little groups that get together where you get to know one another. That's it. And the last thing, of course, is caring for our community. If we as Christians are going to earn the right to talk about God's love with other people, it starts with the willingness to go care about our community and give a rip. We earn the right. I don't know if you know this or not, but we're the away team now in some ways. In some ways. So I got a little journaling challenge for you. That's the last sheet in your packet. This is journaling according to the spirit of John Wesley, according to Pastor Andy, journaling. But this is my Lenten practice this year. I thought I would share it with you. Encourage you just to check it out. And as I thought about John Wesley and what he did in terms of how he developed his relationship with God, I thought, I'm going to try this myself. So I share it with you. And then I'll end it with one last story. And it's 7 o'clock, so I'll wrap it up. But if you go to my last slide, Maggie, this has absolutely nothing to do with Methodism. But I think it has everything to do with us today. Who is this? His name is John Phillips. Who's John Phillips? Well, he's got a park named after him in some random town in England that I can't even remember the name of it. I'll have to Google it. But I remember the park because I read the sign. John Phillips was the SOS operator on the Titanic. The first time that they ever used SOS was on the Titanic as it sank. And if you read aboard. And it said that he stayed there and he kept hitting the SOS, even while the ship sank. Even after the captain gave the order, every man for himself, every person for themselves, he kept hitting the SOS anyway, and he went down with the Titanic. And I thought to myself, what a powerful image for what it means to be a Christian today. What are we called to do? We're called to hit the SOS button. In the midst of a world where it feels like maybe the ship's sinking, in the midst of a world where a leader is saying every person for themselves, the John Phillips of the world, the Christians of the world keep hitting the SOS button and say, no, how we live matters. God's love matters. And I'm going to keep hitting this button. Even if the ship sinks, I'm going to keep hitting the button. People like Wesley hit the button. The others hit the button. What's our call? Hit the button. Hit the button. We earn the right to talk about God's love with other people by caring for them. We develop our relationship with God's love by getting together in communities with one another. This is what it means to practice the gospel. This is what it means to hit the button. You know, I don't know if the ship's going to sink or make it. I don't know. You don't know. We don't know. But I found that man's story compelling. He kept hitting it. Even when people were saying every person for themselves, he's like, no. I'm going to do the right thing. I'll keep doing the right thing. All right. If you want to know more, I'll be up here for a few minutes. If you want to see some of John Wesley's books, I got them here. And I encourage you to show up next week as Pastor Glenda talks about different ways that we can develop small groups. And then I encourage you, of course, to come the third week where we talk about some concrete ways where we hope to care for our community. But as you go forward tonight, God bless you. Thank you for living through my geeking out with John Wesley in England presentation. God bless.